So the Patreon votes for a special video this time asked for a look at naval planning, logistics, procurement and production. Now we're going to look at all four of these topics, although as always this kind of thing can be talked about in multiple books worth of content, so this is necessarily an overview and specific examples may be left out. I'm also going to reorder it into planning, procurement, production and logistics, not just for the alliterative quality, but logistics play a part throughout the entire process, as hopefully we'll see, but supply logistics become a distinct thing to be discussed once the ships, etc., are actually in active service. So the first part, planning. Now, this is always a little bit of an interesting one because planning involves deciding what kind of navy you actually want. And that can be a bit more of a challenge than you might otherwise think, because you've got broadly three scenarios, since unless it's absolutely forced on them, no one wants to reduce their navy. So you either have the choice of we have a navy and we want to keep our navy where it stands relative to all the other navies. You also have we have a navy but we want our navy to be bigger than all the other navies, or we want to move up the food chain a bit. So that first part, maintaining where you are, is pretty much the British Empire's position for most of the age of steam and steel. The position of we want to move on up in the world, this is more the position of the French Navy initially, and the Russian Navy, believe it or not, initially. Later on, arguably the American Navy. And then lastly, you have the position of we don't really have a navy, but we would like to have a navy, and so we need to decide what kind of navy we're actually going to build. This last is actually in some ways the position that the US Navy found itself in towards the end of the 19th century, believe it or not, even after the American Civil War, and also the position that the Imperial German Navy found itself in around about the same time. Both nations, yes, technically they had navies, but they were pretty much coastal defense forces at the time. So we're talking in terms of blue water, ocean-going navies that can challenge other navies for dominance of either the whole or selected parts of the ocean. So, well, at least you know where you are now, and you have a vague idea about where you want to be. This is well and good. How do you actually get there? And where is there? So this is where the more technical side of planning comes in, but also, unfortunately, where it can be influenced by politics. So when you are planning your navy, as we said, we've got a rough idea about where we stand, but where do we want to be? Because if you want to maintain your position in the world relative to the other navies, that can mean all sorts of different things depending on where on the ladder you are at the moment. So let's take some relatively textbook examples. Let's say you are the Spanish Navy in the early 1900s. Okay, a lot of your ships have been shot to pieces by the Americans a few years earlier, but you were maybe a low second, higher third level naval power, and you want to maintain that. So what do? Well, you need battleships. Great, everyone's got dreadnoughts, so you need a dreadnought. You can't build a pre-dreadnought, otherwise everyone's going to laugh at you. But you also can't afford more than maybe one or two decent-sized ones, but that will mean that you won't have a continuous dreadnought force, so you have to identify, right, well, we have a planning need for a set of small dreadnoughts, hence the España class. Conversely, if you are someone like the UK and you want to maintain your position as dominant naval power, you have to plan extensively because you have to look at, well, there's a whole load of ships that we have that are obsolete that need to be gotten rid of, but we also need replacements, and possibly with new technologies and new ship types developing, we need to identify whether those replacements are good enough, or do we need to replace with a brand new class? Do we need to do replacements for our old ships and introduce new ships of this new class or type, and so on and so forth? To be honest, the planning job is actually easiest when you're doing something like the Imperial German Navy or the US Navy at the end of the 1800s, where you've almost got a blank slate to go on. Nevertheless, planning still involves a lot more than just knowing what kind of fleet you want to end up with. Other critical aspects that are involved in the planning stage are things such as how big are my shipyards? How long are my dry docks? This will dictate the maximum size of ship that you can actually build, along with other nice, neat questions such as can I actually produce the armor plate in the necessary thicknesses and quantities? Can I produce the guns? Are these going to have to be outsourced overseas? Do I have overseas friends, or at least non-enemies, who will sell me these things? And such like. And if the answer to that is no, then you have to start thinking about developing your war industry and infrastructure first. And obviously, dry docks and shipyards. Well, if you're going to get it built overseas, you can skip the shipyards issue. But if you are planning on maintaining them for yourself, you still need docks and dry docks capable of handling them, even if you don't have a slipway. So all these issues come into planning. And then there's a matter of, well, assuming that you have the requisite industry, how much of it do you have? Because it's all very well having a steel industry that can turn out 14, 15, or 16-inch guns, and foundries that can churn out 12, 13, 14-inch thick armor plate. But if they can only produce them at a rate that allows you to build 2 battleships a year, there's no point on planning on building 4. And if you're thinking about building a fleet to challenge somebody who can build 4, 6, or 8 battleships a year, then again, it's a case of, do we start planning on building ships and just irritating someone who can easily outbuild us, or do we start planning for construction of more naval industry and infrastructure in the first place before we start trying to outbuild someone who's got a lot more industry than we do? So this lays out the very basics. The next stage of planning is to look at finance. So how much money do you actually have? Now, this can kind of be exemplified by the US Navy in the run-up to World War One. The US Congress had decided that, yes, they very definitely wanted to expand the US Navy beyond what was effectively a coastal defense force with a lot of very obsolete ships, but they weren't willing to pay for it. So the US Navy, when it was planning, had to decide, well, we want to build a big ocean-going fleet, but what are the biggest and longest lead items of that? Well, the answer being obviously battleships. And so with the limited funding that they had, they decided they were going to build battleships pretty much exclusively, not entirely, but near enough. This is one of the reasons why up until the middle of the 1910s, all the US dreadnought battleships came in pairs, because that was literally everything that the US Navy could afford, having taken the fairly sensible approach that the US industry would allow them to build significantly more ships if only they had more money. And so in a time of war, destroyers, which were fairly quick to build, and cruisers, which, whilst not especially fast to build, were at least faster than battleships, could be built in the immediate run-up to or during hostilities, whereas a battleship very definitely could not be. And to a certain extent they were right. If you look at the sheer numbers of Clemson and Wicks-class destroyers they managed to produce. On the other hand, they were also a little bit wrong when you look and realise that the only modern cruisers they would end up having would be the Omahas, which came just that little bit too late for World War One. But they did the best they could with the money they had available. So again, finance affects your planning in a big way. So, you know what kind of fleet you want to build. You know whether or not you can build it, whether you're going to have to order it in, takeaway battleship, and you know now whether or not you can actually afford it. So you know how many of the things you can actually build or order. Great. Now, what kind of ship are you going to build? Again, you have to look at the situation that you're in. If you are a nation like the United States, you need to plan for ships that are able to sail a very long distance pretty much without refueling, because you have very long distance commitments but not a tremendous amount of overseas bases. If you're the UK, you have even more long-range, long-distance overseas commitments, but you have a vast network of bases, so you can perhaps plan to have your ships be slightly shorter range and save some of that displacement for other things like weapons or armor or crew accommodation or whatever. But you then have to invest in the infrastructure, or hope you've already got the infrastructure local in your various overseas holdings. And again, even if you're the US, you still have to invest in some overseas or semi-overseas fueling bases and depots. This is why the Pacific Fleet was based on the West Coast for a very long period of time, right up until it moved to Pearl Harbor, just in time for the Japanese to show up. So this is all part of your planning procedure. So those are the two big obvious ones. Now, when you look at some of the smaller navies, let's say Italy. Italy not possessed of a great deal of long distance overseas commitments, so is going to be fighting in the Mediterranean. So this dictates that since your most likely opponent is France, and France is building full-scale ocean-going capital ships, you also have to build full-scale ocean-going capital ships, but you don't have anything like the range requirements that Britain or America does, so you can afford to skimp out on that a little bit in exchange for other things. In the Italians' case, they chose speed more than anything else. And if you are the Germans, you are looking at trying to fight the Royal Navy, or the French, or the Russians, or well, almost anyone else who has a navy in Northern Europe. The good news for you is you're slap bang in the middle of all of them, so you don't have to go very far. But unlike the Italians, you know there's a fair chance that you probably are going to be horrifically outnumbered, so you can't necessarily go for high speed in what's effectively an enclosed environment like the North Sea. You need a certain amount of speed, but sacrificing extra displacement that you've won at the cost of range to go a little bit faster probably isn't going to work out all that well for you, because the enemy can just have ships in the place that you're going as well as the place that you're coming from. So perhaps then more armor might be of use to you. So you can see how all these decisions are actually being made right back at the planning stage to determine what kind of navy you're actually going to end up with. So once you've established all of these things, you can take a look at what those restrictions have imposed upon you in terms of what kind of ships you can design, and you now have to loop back to the what kind of navy do I want, i.e. do the restrictions in your infrastructure, in the operational conditions that you're going to be working in, your finances, and to a certain extent the political willingness to take this all forward, do they all match up with the fleet that you want? If they do, happy days. If they don't, you're either going to have to revisit whichever factor is blocking that, or you're going to have to go back to your political masters and bosses and say, well, actually, we can't have what we want. We might have to aim lower. And both of these, again, have historical examples. So the blocker, for example, let's say would be the Royal Navy during the Anglo-German naval arms race. The Royal Navy actually couldn't afford quite as many ships as the public were pressuring it to, and saying, well, the public was saying we want a fleet of this size, Parliament was saying we want a fleet of this size. The Royal Navy was kind of, it can't really get that for what you're giving us. And the political side, to a certain extent, at various points, was also trying to cut back on spending. And so people like Lord Fisher show up and scrap a bunch of old ships. Well, that frees up maintenance budgets and crew, so all of a sudden you've solved half of your problem, and then the public pressure forces the government to give you more money, and all of a sudden, oh look, we can have the fleet that we actually want. The flip side of going back and telling political masters, no, we can't, is never a particularly popular one, but ultimately the Germans do actually go and do this during the Anglo-Germans naval arms race. They eventually just turn and say, look, our naval industry just can't, even though our overall industry might be able to compete with the UK, our naval industry just cannot compete with what the British are doing, considering they're outbuilding us and building a bunch of ships for foreign orders. And they have shipyards screaming for work because some of them still don't have enough work to do. So we're going to have to aim for what actually Tirpitz originally wanted, which was a fleet big enough to worry the Royal Navy, not a fleet big enough to outfight the Royal Navy on even terms, which is somehow what had morphed into halfway through the arms race. So, if you followed all of these planning steps, you now know, at least hopefully vaguely realistically, what kind of fleet you want, how quickly you can build it, what size, shape, and performance characteristics your ships generally have to have, given the environment you're going to be operating in, and you can go into taking all these and putting them together into a design or designs, depending on if you're building part of a fleet or an entire fleet from scratch. So far, so good. Well done. You have now successfully got a plan. Now you have to actually procure the thing. And anyone who's worked in a large organisation will know that procurement can be a horrible, horrible job. But let's look at it anyway. So, naval procurement, this comes back obviously to finance in a lot of ways, but we're assuming that you've dealt with that issue during the planning stage. So, you've got your money. Now, how do you spend it? Well, the first thing to do is to identify what you call your long lead items. These are complex bits of technology or machinery that you are going to need for your ship, but may have fairly long production times of their own. The most common long lead items in warships generally are the engines and the guns. Both of these are fairly important to battleships and cruisers, well, and any warship really. But they do take an incredibly long amount of time to build, and especially with engines, you kind of do need them relatively soon in the build process. There's absolutely nothing worse than building a battleship, finishing the weapons and superstructure install, and then realizing you can't go anywhere because you forgot to put the engines in. And as we've discussed in one of the dry dock episodes, big caliber naval guns take a long time to build, so you have to order these things in advance as well. This, for example, is the reason why, despite the South Dakota 1920 battleships and the Lexingtons were mostly not actually built, or were only very, very partially built, with the exception, obviously, of a couple of the Lexingtons, they actually had a full set of machinery and guns for the 16-inch 50 guns all ready to go for them because they'd all been ordered as long lead items before the ships themselves had been laid down. Obviously, they then found other uses in other ships, both in refits and as coastal defense guns, but that's more of a happy accident. And of course, you also got to order the other complex moving parts. So it's not just the engines. You've got to order the manufacture of the propellers, which in and of itself is a fairly fine grade process. Obviously, all the secondary weapons. And then when we're talking about the bulk of the Dreadnought era, you're also talking about things such as fire control systems and later on radar and maybe even sonar. Now, if you're on a bit of a tight budget, these expenditures can be spread out over several years because, as we said, long lead items. So you might pay for your guns and your engines 1 year, and then the next year you might actually start paying for the construction of the ship and gathering of materials, and then the next year after that you might start paying for some of the ancillary stuff like fire control systems. Of course, this assumes you aren't in a constant build loop like most of the nations were in the early part of the 20th century, especially during the 1910s and 1900s, where new ships were having to be ordered almost every year. At which point you're effectively paying for the cost of a new ship or ships every year. It's just that the individual parts you're paying for may be scattered across several ships, because at any one point you'll have maybe two different classes of ships building, one fitting out, one just starting up, one coming into service, etc. Your other major choice in procurement is going to come down to where you're buying these things from. So, if you're a smaller naval power, as we said in planning, you might have had to plan to order these things from another nation or nations. Now, again, this gives you a bit of a choice. You can put all your eggs in one basket and say, we're going to order this ship lock, stock, and barrel from a single nation, which has certain advantages, especially if that nation has a bunch of existing infrastructure and designs that you can draw upon for your own ships. So something like the Rivadavia class of Argentina, or the Almirante La Torre and its never completed sister for Chile. Those ordered in whole from America and the UK, respectively. Alternatively, you can try and pick the best of all worlds, because you might think, well, this nation has better guns, this nation has a better deal on the hull, this nation has better engines, this nation has better fire control, and if you've got friendly enough relations with all of those nations, you can try ordering all the different parts from lots of different nations and put them all together. In theory, this can give you a better ship, but it also means you are vastly increasing the risk of one or the other nations not being able, for whatever reason, to deliver those components. Now, if they just flat out won't give them to you, that's one thing. You can always try and get them from somewhere else, although you might lose a bit of money on it. But if it's a fundamental breakdown in relationships between two different nations, both of which are your suppliers, you may never see the ship at all. Notable victims and actually successes in this case are the Greeks, who continuously, when they were ordering foreign ships, apart from when they just bought off the shelf pre-built pre-dreadnoughts, otherwise generally tended to have ships that were built by one nation, had guns from another nation, engines from a third, and so on and so forth. They lucked out massively with the Georgios Averof and got a very, very nice armoured cruiser out of it. But every time they tried to build or order a ship called Salamis, somebody ended up at war with somebody else, and they would never see those ships. So, yeah, it can have its advantages and disadvantages. Ordering from a single supplier, again, advantages and disadvantages. For example, the Argentines obviously got the Rivadavia. The Chileans, yeah, they had to wait a little bit for the Almirante Littorio, and they never got the Almirante Cochrane. But on the other hand, it did mean that at the end of World War One, they just had to negotiate with Britain to get their hands back on the Almirante Littorio, which they successfully did. Whereas, yeah, again, the poor old Greeks, they'd contracted with so many different people, but the hull of Salamis was in Germany, and the Allies were not particularly happy to see Germany building any warships at all, period, which, amongst other things, rather complicated that whole debacle. Now, assuming that you have decided to buy from overseas, well, great, now you know how to do that, but assuming that you've decided to buy local, well, now you have even more choices. Isn't this fun? So, your choices when it comes to local procurement, you can go, at least with most major naval net powers, with either nationalised building, or you can go with private contracts. And when I say nationalised building, don't suddenly imagine the communist flag flying over everything. This may simply be your nation's government-owned dockyards. So, for example, in the UK, you could have a contract with Camel Laird, or Laird as it was for most of the time. You could have a contract with Vickers Armstrong, or Vickers Armstrong, again, depending on the period. There's or Thornycroft or Yarrow, depending if you're building destroyers, more perhaps go to them. All these lovely private suppliers and more. You've even got Holland and Wolff in Belfast. But at the same time, you have the Royal Dockyards, Chatham, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Devonport, a number of others. So this again gives you a little bit of swings and roundabouts. So a naval dockyard, or let's say if you're in the US, you've got things like Norfolk in Virginia as well. And obviously Germany's got a bunch of nationally owned slipways, as well as private ones owned by industries like Vulcan or Krupp. So you have a choice there, and the advantages and disadvantages of it is that obviously a private yard, well, they're the ones who are responsible for cost overruns if you write the contract properly. The yard that you own and pay for, you're the one who's going to end up footing that particular bill. On the other hand, a nationally owned dockyard usually is slightly faster. That's not necessarily always the case, but certainly in the UK, the Royal Dockyards could usually churn out ships a lot quicker than the private dockyards could, whereas perhaps in other countries that may or may not be the case. Obviously, the flip side to that is that a private dockyard might come up with some new and innovative technology that they might decide, or method of working that they might just decide to ramp through and increase the production speed or quality of your vessel. Whereas if somebody came up with that in a government-owned dockyard, they would have to go through quite a lot more bureaucratic paperwork before it ever got implemented. So there are swings and roundabouts to both of those, and you tend to find that in nations where there were both public and privately owned dockyards available, generally ships would be split between the two interests. So you'd have some built by nationally owned dockyards and others built by private dockyards, with varying degrees of quality and success. And to a certain degree, although not in all things, but to a certain degree, this also applies broadly to the various components of your ship. So the Admiralty was capable of building its own boilers. Thornycroft and Yarrow, however, could generally churn out better boilers if you wanted that high-end, high-speed performance for destroyers. And same with guns. You had Royal Ordnance Factory, but you also had Vickers Armstrong, both of which could make guns, as long as someone gave them the plans on how to do it. And similarly in the US, you have things like Bethlehem Steel, perfectly capable of making, actually, in their case, both guns and ships, as with Vickers Armstrong. Well, actually, to be honest, in the US, do you really want the Bureau of Ordnance touching your weapons? Probably not, but sometimes you might be forced to. So these are all the decisions you're going to face when it comes to procurement and where you're going to spend your money. And then, of course, you have to bring them all together. And this is also going to affect your procurement choices, especially if you're in a very big country like America or Russia. Or if you lack the industry for certain things and you have to import certain components, like Japan for a significant portion of the early 1900s and 1910s period. Because it's all very well saying, well, actually, we know this manufacturer, be it public or private, in our country makes absolutely excellent guns, and this manufacturer makes absolutely excellent hulls. If you're, let's say we're going with the US because that's the easiest example, if your gun manufacturer is based in Washington State and your hull manufacturer is based in Virginia, moving one to the other is going to incur quite a number of logistical challenges and a certain degree of cost implication. So you then need to look at it and go, well, actually, well, again, back to cost, can we afford it? And B, if we can afford it, is the extra money worth the advantage that we're getting? If not, then you might want to go with a different supplier who maybe can't quite match the same quality, but if there's only a percentage point or two in it, the fact that they might be near enough on top of each other will offer you significant cost savings, which then might allow you to build another ship. Especially if you're building a battleship, you might be able to slip a destroyer in there somewhere. This is why certain names crop up again and again and again. Obviously, the most common examples being places like Bethlehem Steel and Vickers Armstrong, because they were capable of churning out multiple different types of high quality naval equipment, both hulls and guns and all other sorts of things, which made it very attractive to just order them all from the same person, because then they're all there at the same point at the same time. You don't have to worry about moving them across country to meet up with each other. All of this, of course, assumes that you are going purely for the best that you can get in terms of cost benefit. You also probably have to deal in most places with politics, which may demand that you order X, Y, or Z component from A, B, or C manufacturer purely on political terms, whether that's because the ruling party needs votes in that district, or whether your senator or congressman or parliamentarian or whatever it is you're calling your elected representative needs votes from that area, or because there's some kind of social aid program trying to create jobs in that area or maintain jobs in that area, or if it's a case of you have to appeal to the pride of that area in order to keep them from rioting and burning down your national organization, as, let's say, Austria-Hungary had to do when they were building the Tegethoff class, and they ended up having to order the Svent Istvan from a Hungarian shipyard, which had no real business building a battleship, but it made the Hungarians happy, so it kept everyone on an even keel. Well, having said that, it didn't keep St. Istvan on an even keel when it got hit, but that's another matter entirely. So, you've planned your fleet, you've paid for your fleet, now you have to actually produce your fleet. And this is where, again, hopefully you've checked all this before, but this is where things start to actually take shape, literally. So your production facilities are obviously very important. You have to keep a very tight eye on them, and you also have to make sure that your materials are arriving in good order and good time. And this may involve going all the way back to planning and procurement. This may involve building new infrastructure. For example, heavy-duty railway lines, more powerful cranes, and such like. And this can be very important actually for the smaller powers, because in the video on South American dreadnoughts, I mentioned that during a temporary disarmament and peace phase between Chile and Argentina, they had the rather interesting problem of having ordered a bunch of foreign warships and needing to disarm them. They didn't actually have a crane between them that was strong enough to lift the turrets off of some of their larger warships, which was a little bit inconvenient. And obviously, if you're trying to build a warship, you might have the gun manufacturer, you might have the turret manufacturer, you might have the hull manufacturer, the armor manufacturer, everything. But if your shipyard doesn't have a crane that's capable of lifting the heavy duty items on board, again, slight problem. Now, as part of your production process, you have to decide how quickly you want to actually produce these things. Because you can go all Lord Fisher with HMS Dreadnought and say everybody's working 3 shifts, near enough 7 days a week, except for the break we're going to give them to attend church, because early 20th century, this is still very important. And you can churn out a ship like HMS Dreadnought in less than a year from keel to launch. Great, fantastic. Except that's just cost you an insane amount of money because you had to pay everybody for those extra shifts, especially the night shifts where they're going to expect a little bit more money, the weekend working, etc. And that's going to extend well beyond the dockyard, because you're going to have to be rushing materials in. That means the material production speed's going to have to increase, which means everyone else is also going to be working overnight and 7 days a week. So yeah, that's a bit of a choice for when it comes to your production values. Also, once you have built the hull of the ship itself, that's only the start. When you see a ship launched, and if you look at videos of ships launching, especially battleships, you'll notice they look very much unlike their later appearance. They almost just look like the hull, and that's basically because that's pretty much what they are. When you start adding things like superstructure and guns and such like, well, for one thing, those tend to affect the balance of the ship. They make it less stable. And when you have the entirety of the ship out of water, reducing the stability when you're about to catapult it at high speed down a ramp into the water is not necessarily something you want to do. Take a quick browse through Google and you'll see all sorts of hilarious instances where people have tried to build ships with some or all of that above main deck structure intact, even civilian ships, and quite a few of them go straight into the water, and they go straight over because they have not been properly ballasted or fitted out yet. Plus, obviously, all that extra weight will press down on the hull, which is resting on blocks and runners. It's not resting fully in the water, so it's not designed for, so you might damage the hull. But anyway, all of this, production-wise, is getting around to the fact that once you've launched the hull, you're going to have to tow the ship over to a fitting-out dock or a fitting-out basin, which may or may not be in the same harbour, for the rest of the stuff to be stuck on top of it. And this is always a little bit of a fun job, because it means that not only have you got to have all your heavy-duty cranes over there in your dockyard, you've also got to have all your heavy-duty cranes over here in your fitting-out yard, and all your naval infrastructure to be able to support all of that. So all your train lines and your warehouses and everything spread out massively. This is exactly why naval facilities like Portsmouth and Virginia and Kiel and Hamburg, etc., this is why they get so big, because they've got to spread everything out effectively. You imagine all the individual components that all cram into a battleship. Now imagine them all taken out and spread out over a wide area on a 2D plane. This is near enough what you have to actually do while you're building the thing. And this is actually one of the reasons why Portsmouth nowadays, despite being a hotbed of naval construction way back in the, well, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, this is why they don't build that many ships there anymore, because Portsmouth actually has hit its size limits, and they just can't build ships on the scale that modern shipbuilding demands. This is why Queen Elizabeth class carriers were built further up north. I mean, also political considerations to try and keep everybody together and in one country, but even if they'd wanted to, I don't think you can build a Queen Elizabeth in Portsmouth. So yeah, that's your production side of things. It's actually one of the easier parts of things, because once you made choices about rate of production and location, you pretty much just watch everyone get on with it and try and introduce as much labor and cost and time saving things as you possibly can. Um, One of the rather interesting things, obviously, is again, as we covered in the video on USS Texas, is the fact that you might end up with extremely high technology, like, say, a super dreadnought battleship, being built by extremely low technology, like, say, mules walking up wooden ramps on scaffold by the side of the ship. So, never be surprised by what kind of stuff goes into building a battleship, because it is everything from steel to donkeys. And so, with that, we come to the final bit. You've planned what kind of fleet you want. You've paid for the kind of fleet you want. You've built the kind of fleet you want. Great. Now what are you going to do with it? Well, assuming you're not immediately going to war with somebody, and actually even if you are, you have to keep this fleet moving because, yeah, ships don't stay intact. They're incredibly complex bits of machinery, and incredibly complex bits of machinery have a wonderful tendency to break very quickly. However, there is also the fact that you've just put them at sea, and the sea is pretty much the single most hostile operating environment on the planet for anything made of metal. And assuming that we are talking about the steam and steel era, guess what? You've just made a bunch of ships out of metal. And once you get into the Second World War and thereafter, they've also got all sorts of wonderful electronics in them, which are even less happy to be in a moist sea salt laden environment than the bare metal of the hull. So this is where naval logistics really start coming into play. We mentioned right back at the planning stage you might have had to identify places that you're going to have to put refueling depots and the like. You're also going to have to look at fortifying them or assigning permanent guard ships to them. But that is more static. When it comes to the logistics of keeping the ships themselves in working order and at sea, you have to think about things like food, water, at least until desalination plants come in, morale boosting items such as ice cream and alcohol, depending on the type of ship that you are, the type of navy that you're part of. Then you've got to have spare parts, because ships can carry a certain number of spare parts, but once they've gone through those spare parts, they need more. And to be honest, there may also be large spare parts that may be needed, but that is impractical for the ship to actually carry because the thing might only be needed occasionally. You've then also got to take into account fuel. Obviously, well, when it's coal, just go into a port. When it's oil, ideally you want to be in a port, but you've got different types of ships in your fleet. And if you're on an operation where, say, you're taking your battleships and your carriers over long distance parts of the ocean to go and attack somebody, you need cruisers and destroyers to help escort you. The cruisers might be able to make it there. The destroyers almost certainly won't. So you've got to devise refueling and replenishment ships for those smaller craft to come and refuel themselves, restock themselves, resupply themselves, and repair themselves as well. So there's this whole other aspect to it. So this means that not only have you got a battle fleet, you also have a logistical support fleet, and the number and type of logistical support ships is going to dictate how far your ships can operate beyond their radius of action from your port. And this is an incredibly important bit of information to know. The US Navy in the Second World War, for example, was pretty much unparalleled in its ability to operate vast numbers of ships on the other side of the Pacific Ocean with relatively minimal facilities in terms of resupply, refuel, and repair. Even Pearl Harbor, was being in Hawaii, was obviously a lot closer, was still several thousand miles away from many of the operational areas. And whilst some refuel, resupply, and repair bases would be set up on small islands, they were nowhere near enough to service the needs of the kind of numbers of ships the US was putting into the theatre. And it was only through the efforts of fleet oilers, fleet replenishment ships, etc., that this was kept going. The British relied primarily on systems of naval bases that they had courtesy of having an empire, but they found themselves having to learn from the Americans fairly sharpish once they got into the Pacific area themselves. And this can be really small bits of logistical technique, such as how do you refuel a ship at sea from an oiler? It seems fairly easy. We'll run hoses from one to the other, turn on the tap. Now one ship has less fuel, the other ship has more fuel. Fantastic, great. Okay, where are those ships going to be relative to each other? You see, this makes all the difference. The Royal Navy's initial idea, which seemed a little bit sensible, was kind of similar to how you would tow a ship, have a ship go in front and the other ship go behind. This didn't work so well. It seemed to make sense on paper, but ships had a lot of trouble speeding up and slowing down, especially considering that warships are designed for a lot higher speeds than most transport and supply ships, and hoses will keep parting. The other thing is, if you're doing this with the kind of problems of speeding up and slowing down, you generally only do this one at a time. The US Navy, on the other hand, developed the side-by-side method, which was actually a lot easier. And it also meant you could resupply to at least two ships at once, because you could have one on either side of the oiler, and the oiler could be happily pumping out away. Any minor variances in speed would simply cause the ships to change position relative to each other slightly, which meant you could have enough slack on your hoses in order to account for that until you could come back up to normal. This also meant that you could have rather amusing situations where you could have a battleship next to an oiler taking on oil, and then you might have a cruiser or a destroyer or multiple destroyers next to the battleship taking on oil from the battleship, with the battleship acting as a little bit of a bridge between the two. So logistics is a big part, and obviously if you're going to plan on fighting a major battle, then you're also potentially going to need ships coming around that can restock on ammunition, and ships that can provide limited but greater repair capability than the ship's crew can provide with their own supplies, bearing in mind that both crew and repair supplies may have been sadly reduced by the action of combat that has caused them to need the repairs in the first place. And you can see this with any navy, because this is a hard and fast rule. So this is why the Graf Spee in World War II, when it kept out and about in the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, worrying the Allies for quite a bit of 1939 and early 1940, it's a case of, well, yeah, it can run around perfectly well, but it would never have lasted without the Altmark. The Altmark brought it all its supplies, and it took a few supplies off captured ships as well, but the Altmark primarily was the ship that resupplied the Graf Spee, and without that, it would not have been able to sustain its voyage anywhere near as long as it did. But even then, it was showing signs of wear and tear, because albeit that it was a supply ship, the Altmark was not a fleet repair ship, nor were there any fleet replenishment bases in the area, and so Graf Spee's propulsion system was suffering quite a bit by the time of its final battle. So this is simplified logistics. Logistics themselves are a huge operation, and this is, as we said before, will determine how many ships you can project overseas. And this can make or break your Navy's ability to project power on a global scale. So if we fast forward to the modern day, the US Navy can support, well, I don't know if it can necessarily support every single ship it has, but it can support pretty much as many ships as it needs to from its existing fleet, at pretty much any point in the world, partly through having some overseas bases, but mostly through the efforts of its resupply and replenishment fleet, which is huge and an often unsung part of the US Navy's efforts. It's all very well going on about Arleigh Burke this and Nimitz or Ford class that, But if you've run out of food and oil and spare parts, you ain't going anywhere, mate. So all those lovely supply ships floating along behind are as much of an important part of the Navy as any of the combat ships. And on a small scale, the Royal Navy, albeit it is a shadow of its former self in terms of numbers and strike power, but the Royal Navy maintains a very large, for its size, replenishment, resupply, and logistics fleet. And this in turn means that, as the Argentinians found out to their cost, if you really, really annoy the British, they can show up with pretty much their entire navy. Whereas you, even though you might be a lot closer to home because they're coming to you, may not actually be able to sustain your entire navy up against them, which gives them quite the advantage. Never mind the fact the Royal Navy is still larger than the vast majority of navies on the planet. And this is one of the reasons why, despite the overall numerical superiority in size, something like the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force cannot really be viewed as a global player in naval terms. If they could operate their significant size fleet across the world, then they would be. However, they can't, because their supply and resupply and logistical flotilla is pretty small, all things considered. Similar with the South Korean Navy, actually. It's a fairly substantial combat force. Can't really operate that far beyond South Korea and any great numbers. And this is one of the reasons why experts in the field, as they're experts, will always study logistics, because again you have fleets like China's, where China is obviously wants to operate across the world as well, so they are building up their resupply fleet just as heavily as they are their combat fleet. But again, no one ever talks about that in the popular news because everyone just focuses on the things that are carrying the missiles and the guns. Albeit a bunch of the supply ships may also be carrying the missiles and the guns, just not able to fire them. So there you go. That's supply logistics for you in a nutshell. And I know that there are a few people who are viewing the channel and hopefully sub to the channel who have served or are serving in those supply ships. So shout out to them, and I'm sure that they can supply quite a few interesting stories in the comments if they so choose. So as we near the 50-minute mark, I think that's a fairly good spot to wrap it up. I hope you've learned a little bit from this, as I said, very brief and general overview of effectively Drax's guide on how to build a navy, going all the way from planning your navy to paying for your navy to building your navy and then keeping your navy supplied and operational when you actually go out to oppress somebody or to defend your own interests. And those things may or may not be the same thing anyway. So, yeah, with that said, if you've got any further comments, clarifications, stories you want to tell from your own service, or you think I've missed something big out, or you want to ask for further detail on any specific field or point that I might have covered, feel free to do so below, and I hope to see you there. Hope to see you in other videos. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again on whatever the next video is.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.